I still remember the cold bite of the Volga wind, sharper than any blade, cutting through the ragged uniform that clung to my body during those endless nights at Stalingrad. We were young men hardened by hunger, dust and fire, but even steel bends under the weight of constant shelling. Imagine the ground trembling beneath you. Imagine the smell of iron and smoke filling your lungs. And then imagine that in the middle of this madness, while the city itself seemed to scream, the sky tore open with something we had no words for. Let me ask you directly, if you were standing in the ruins of a dying city, surrounded by tanks and artillery, and you suddenly saw a silent light hovering above the battlefield, would you believe it was just another trick of the mind? Or would you admit the possibility that something far older, far stranger than human war was at play? Before I continue, let me remind you, subscribe and follow this channel, because history has far more secrets than textbooks will ever confess, and together we will uncover them. We had no language for what we saw that night. Soviet doctrine trained us to describe everything in terms of material evidence, yet the human eye betrays ideology. Across the charred skeletons of factories and broken apartment blocks, we saw a sphere of light gliding slowly above the smoke. It wasn't a German flare. I knew the difference because flares hiss, burn unevenly, and drift. This thing was steady, unnervingly smooth, as if it had its own will. Some soldiers crossed themselves, whispering Orthodox prayers, though religion was forbidden in the Red Army. Others cursed, calling it a German trick, some kind of new weapon from Hitler's so-called Wunderwaffe projects. But me, I stood frozen, clutching my rifle like a talisman, thinking that no human engineer could make the night itself hold its breath. To understand why this mattered, you have to picture the historical weight pressing down on us. Stalingrad wasn't just another city, it was Stalin's name carved into stone, and losing it meant not just military defeat, but a symbolic collapse of Soviet resolve. Hitler had thrown entire armies into the furnace, and Stalin had answered by ordering us to defend every brick, every street corner, every ruined basement. We fought over the same staircase for days, dying in piles, the bodies becoming sandbags for the living. And then, above this theater of death, something shone silently, as if mocking our small struggles. Even in a century of brutal ideology, the human mind seeks meaning. Was it a sign? A warning? A judgment from powers neither Stalin nor Hitler could command? I've read later, in fragments smuggled from old archives, that reports of similar sightings appeared in different fronts of the war. Allied pilots called them Foo Fighters, mysterious orbs of light that danced around aircraft and vanished. But we, standing knee-deep in rubble and blood, had no fancy name. We only had fear and awe. Some whispered that it was Stalin himself, sending angels of steel to watch over us. Others claimed it was the souls of our fallen comrades, rising in fire to light the path of vengeance. I could not decide which frightened me more, that it was human or that it was not. Let me pause to give you a modern analogy. Imagine today you are in Times Square, the most electric, crowded place in New York, and suddenly all the giant billboards go dark, every phone loses its signal, and a glowing sphere hovers silently over the street. Would you think first of hackers or of aliens? Back then, our Times Square was the burning ruins of Stalingrad, and the blackout was caused not by technology, but by the sheer terror that silenced even the cannons for a moment. The memory of that silence has haunted me more than the explosions. The light lingered. It pulsed faintly as if breathing. When it moved without sound, without tremor, without logic. It glided over German lines, then shifted toward ours. Both sides, for that single heartbeat of history, seemed to stop killing each other, eyes raised upward. And there, in the darkest theater of human cruelty, we were united not by peace but by confusion. The Germans shouted too, pointing, firing a few useless rounds into the sky, the bullets vanishing as though swallowed. It is strange, but for that instant I felt closer to the enemy than to Stalin, because we both looked like ants staring at the same boot. What happened after is harder to pin down. Some swear it absorbed artillery fire without effect. Others insist it simply vanished in a blink. In my memory, it dimmed slowly, retreating into the smoke as if it had seen enough of our madness. Then the war resumed, the crack of rifles and the roar of tanks drowning the silence. But something had changed. Once you have seen the impossible, the possible becomes less convincing. Stalin wanted us to believe only in steel, discipline and sacrifice, but we had seen a light that did not obey orders. Not his, not Hitler's, not anyone's. Later, as I tried to sleep on cold concrete, I kept replaying the image. I thought of ancient stories my grandmother used to whisper, about fiery chariots in the sky, about Ezekiel's wheels, about pagan gods descending in fire. Stalin might call it superstition, but in that moment, superstition felt more honest than propaganda. War teaches you that certainty is a luxury. The only certainty was that something else had looked down on Stalingrad that night, and for a second, both empires shrank before it. So when I ask you now, do you think it was a weapon, a ghost, or a visitor from beyond? I ask not as a soldier, but as someone who has carried this question for decades. History will give you numbers, strategies, dates, but history leaves out the trembling light that no textbook can explain. Subscribe and walk with me further, because the archives of war hold secrets stranger than fiction, and I was there to see them. The day after that strange light appeared above Stalingrad, our commanders acted as if nothing unusual had happened. Orders continued to flow down the chain of command, demanding we hold the riverbank, seize ruined buildings, and resist the Germans at any cost. Yet when I looked into the eyes of my comrades, I knew the memory of that light was burning behind their silence. Soldiers who had once spoken only of ammunition and rations now whispered of omens and curses. I caught myself listening too closely, wondering if the unseen was somehow guiding the outcome of battles that seemed far beyond human endurance. Stalin wanted us to believe the war was a test of ideology, but I began to suspect it was a stage on which forces unknown had chosen to cast their shadows. Stalin himself, though hidden far from the front, was a man consumed by paranoia. He feared not only traitors, generals and foreign spies, but also signs that challenged his control over history. When reports of strange aerial phenomena reached Moscow, they were not treated as curiosities. They were classified, hidden, studied, then silenced. I would learn years later, after my military service, that KGB files described unidentified atmospheric anomalies appearing at critical moments of the war. Some were dismissed as German technology, others as optical illusions, but none were explained to Stalin's satisfaction. He demanded control over everything, over truth itself, and nothing terrified him more than a truth that could not be bent to his will. The irony of Stalin's fear is that it mirrored our own. As soldiers, we feared dying unseen in rubble. Stalin feared dying unseen in history. For him, history was not a record of human struggle, but a weapon to control the living. He rewrote textbooks, altered photographs, erased names from memory. Yet even Stalin could not erase the lights in the sky. Imagine for a moment being the man called the Vozhd, the supreme leader, and realizing that there are powers in the heavens that will not obey you. If Hitler worshipped technology and occult myths to fuel his conquest, Stalin worshipped control, and nothing violated control more than the unexplained. It is easy today, sitting comfortably in a world of satellites and drones, to say those lights were simply misunderstood aircraft. Americans watching from afar might think of Roswell, radar blips, or secret jets tested in Nevada. But in 1942, technology was not capable of what we witnessed. The Luftwaffe had terrifying machines, yes, but nothing that could hover silently for minutes without sound or exhaust. The Soviets had crude rockets and experimental aircraft, but nothing resembling the sphere of light that united enemies in silence. What we saw was as alien to our time as a smartphone would be to the Roman legions. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread through the front lines. Some claimed the light appeared again near the grain elevator, one of the bloodiest landmarks of Stalingrad, where men fought hand to hand until both sides collapsed from exhaustion. Others swore they saw objects darting across the river faster than any plane. I never saw it again personally, but the whispers infected the ranks. A soldier's mind, when starved of food and rest, clings to mystery as fiercely as it clings to bread. We wanted to believe the universe was watching, that our suffering mattered, that we were not just meat in Stalin's grinder. And if something from the stars was looking down, maybe it meant we were more than expendable. Stalin, however, would never allow such thoughts to spread unchecked. Religion had already been crushed, yet now a new kind of faith threatened to rise, a faith not in God but in visitors from elsewhere. I imagine the reports that reached him were read with trembling hands. Did he think of Ezekiel's wheel, of angels, of demons? Or did he see it as a threat to his monopoly on fear? A leader like Stalin needed fear to rule, but he needed it to come from him alone, not from lights in the sky. That may explain why so many reports vanished into locked cabinets, only to re-emerge decades later when the Soviet Union itself was collapsing. I often reflect on how leaders of that era mirrored each other. Hitler sought mystical relics, trying to anchor his madness in legends. Stalin dismissed legends, yet feared any sign he could not control. And in between them, we ordinary soldiers bled in the ruins, caught between ideologies too heavy for human shoulders. When I saw that light, I felt both insignificant and chosen. It is a strange contradiction. You realize your life is small, yet you also sense that smallness is part of something vast. Stalin might call that weakness. I call it the beginning of wisdom. Think of modern America, where UFO hearings in Congress attract attention, not because they offer answers, but because they threaten to reveal that governments, even powerful ones, are not in control of the skies. The Pentagon today struggles with the same problem Stalin faced. How do you admit ignorance without losing authority? If you laugh at the phenomenon, you risk ignoring something real. If you take it seriously, you risk unraveling the narrative of power. Stalin solved the problem by silence. Today, your leaders solve it by classification and public spectacle. Different centuries, same fear. What I carry from those days is not a single sighting, but the way it reshaped the meaning of war for me. We fought for territory, for ideology, for survival, but when the sky revealed something unclaimed by either side, I realized we might all be fighting on borrowed ground. Stalin wanted us to see him as the master of history. Yet history, like the night sky, holds mysteries that no dictator can command. Years after the war ended, when I was no longer a soldier, but just another man trying to live a quiet life in the ruins that had once been my homeland, I began to hear rumors of files hidden deep inside the archives of the secret police. The KGB, they called it, the sword and shield of the party, feared more than the Germans had ever been. For us ordinary veterans, those initials meant silence, surveillance, and the sudden disappearance of neighbors. But for me, they also came to mean something else. The possibility that what I saw in the skies of Stalingrad had been recorded, studied, and perhaps even acknowledged by those in power. Imagine my pulse when a comrade whispered that the strange light we witnessed had not been forgotten, that it had been written into reports stamped with the mark of secrecy. I had contacts through old war friends who worked in ministries, men who had traded rifles for pens, and through their nervous conversations, I learned pieces of the puzzle. The KGB had compiled dossiers on unexplained aerial phenomena, dating back not just to the war, but even earlier, to sightings in remote Siberian villages and above military installations. Some of these files, they said, described metallic discs, others spoke of luminous spheres, and still others recorded silent craft moving against the wind. The language was always clinical, stripped of wonder, yet behind the dry words I could hear the same awe that froze us on the battlefield. Stalin may have feared losing control, but his organs of state security never stopped watching the skies. There is something deliciously ironic about that. The KGB monitored not only human dissidents, but also the heavens themselves. They tapped telephones, opened letters, infiltrated churches, yet they also wrote down the trembling testimony of peasants who swore a glowing object landed in a wheat field. They arrested poets for dreaming of freedom, but they could not arrest the night sky when it flickered with unknown lights. Perhaps that is why the files were hidden so deeply, because to admit their existence was to admit a limit to power. Stalin could imprison a man for whispering, but he could not imprison the unexplained. I never saw the files directly. Veterans like me were not trusted with such secrets. But fragments reached me, copied by trembling hands, retold in cautious conversations over vodka. One account described Stalingrad itself, noting a stationary spherical light observed by both Axis and Soviet forces, duration approximately 7 minutes, no sound detected. That was my night. To see it written in bureaucratic ink, reduced to a line of technical description, was both thrilling and infuriating. We had stood in awe, our souls shaken, and the KGB filed it like a train schedule. Yet in that cold description was also validation. We had not imagined it. It was real enough that even the secret police could not ignore it. Later, I heard whispers that Stalin ordered scientists from captured German laboratories to study these phenomena. After the war, Operation Paperclip brought many German engineers to America. Fewer people know that the Soviets seized their share as well. Jet propulsion experts, rocket scientists, radar technicians, all were told to bend their knowledge toward the new superpower rivalry. And hidden among their assignments, some say, were investigations into non-terrestrial technologies. Were the lights at Stalingrad seen as clues to a higher science, something to be stolen from the gods? Perhaps. The Cold War was not only about nuclear weapons and tanks, but about who could claim the heavens themselves. In those years, secrecy bred imagination. Veterans like me debated whether the objects were Soviet experiments, German remnants, or visitors from elsewhere. Some believed Stalin encouraged the myth, letting people think of aliens rather than admit to his own secret projects. Others argued the opposite, that Stalin buried every mention precisely because he feared the truth. I could never decide, but I knew one thing. The silence of official history was a lie. We had seen, and the files confirmed, that something more than human ambition was at work. When I finally left the military and tried to build a civilian life, I found myself haunted less by the memories of combat than by the memory of that light. Shells and bullets I could understand. The glimmering sphere I could not. And now, hearing Americans speak of Roswell, of Project Blue Book, of congressional hearings, I feel a strange kinship. You believe your government hides truths about the skies. We believe the same, though our government silenced us with fear rather than hearings. Different flags, same shadows. What fascinates me most, even now, is not whether the lights were alien craft or misunderstood weapons. What fascinates me is how the powerful react to them. Stalin's state, with all its brutality, could not confess ignorance, so it buried the evidence. America, with all its democracy, struggles with the same instinct. You hide files, redact documents, classify everything. Because in the end, leaders cannot admit that the world, or the universe, contains mysteries beyond their control. To admit that is to admit weakness, and weakness is forbidden to empires. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine a dusty room in Moscow filled with forgotten folders, each page stamped with red ink, each describing moments when the sky itself refused to obey orders. And I wonder what would happen if those files were open to the world. Would people finally see that history is not only about men and their wars, but about the shadows that fall over them? Or would the truth be drowned in laughter, dismissed as fantasy? Perhaps that is why secrecy always wins, because mystery is more terrifying than any weapon. I cannot prove what we saw. I can only testify. And the KGB, for all its cruelty, left behind fragments that testify too. Together, soldier and spy, witness and bureaucrat, We leave you with a puzzle that no ideology can solve. The lights were real. The question is whether you are ready to believe that history is larger than the human will to control it. I have lived long enough to watch empires rise and collapse, to see flags change, to hear slogans shouted and then forgotten. But through all the noise of politics, one image remains sharper than any speech or statue: that silent light above Stalingrad. It was not the most terrifying thing I experienced. Combat was worse, but it was the most humbling. It reminded me that our greatest struggles might be only footnotes in a story written on a cosmic scale. War, for all its cruelty, is still human. That light was not, and that is why, even decades later, I feel compelled to share it, because history without mystery is only half the truth. In the years after Stalin's death, Khrushchev opened a window of cautious change. Some censorship eased, some files were reviewed. Scientists were allowed to speculate more freely. It was then that I read accounts of unexplained aerial events, not only in Russia but across the globe. American pilots in the Pacific, British gunners in North Africa, even Japanese soldiers in Manchuria, all had reported strange encounters. The war had been global, but so, it seemed, had the mystery. What struck me most was how similar the descriptions were, no matter the language or ideology. Lights that moved without sound, discs that defied physics, shadows that vanished when approached. Enemies might lie, but the consistency of the accounts was undeniable. This realization carried a strange kind of comfort. For once, humanity's divisions seemed irrelevant. Americans, Germans, Soviets, we all looked up and saw the same unexplainable signs. It made our propaganda feel small. Stalin told us we were defending socialism. Hitler told his men they were defending civilization. Roosevelt told Americans they were defending freedom. Perhaps all of us were simply ants building anthills under a sky that refused to explain itself. And if that is true, then perhaps the greatest lie of the 20th century was that we were fighting for ultimate meanings, when in reality we were fighting inside a story we did not write. Yet, as comforting as that thought can be, it is also terrifying. Because if there are forces beyond us, watching, circling, maybe even intervening, then what does human freedom mean? Was the outcome of Stalingrad truly the result of our courage, our sacrifices, our burnt city? Or was it nudged by powers we cannot see? If the light was a sign, who sent it? If it was a machine, who built it? These questions burn hotter in me than any memory of blood or fire. And unlike the war, they have no medals, no memorials, only silence. As the Cold War deepened, both America and the Soviet Union poured resources into the skies. Rockets pierced the atmosphere, satellites orbited the Earth, and humans finally stepped onto the moon. These triumphs were celebrated as victories of ideology: capitalism versus communism, freedom versus tyranny. But beneath the banners, there remained that same shadow of mystery. Even astronauts, trained in science, reported objects they could not identify. Some of those reports were buried in archives, others leaked into rumors. Again, the pattern was the same. Governments claimed control, but the skies whispered otherwise. For me, the most powerful lesson of those years is this: mystery humbles power. Stalin tried to erase the unexplained. America tried to classify it. Both failed. The lights continue to appear, even now. In a way, they mock us. We build bombs that can erase cities, yet we cannot explain a flicker in the sky. We send probes to Mars, yet a sphere of light over a battlefield leaves us speechless. Power, for all its might, crumbles in the face of the unknown. That, to me, is the true secret of history. Let me give you an image that stays with me. Imagine a battlefield littered with helmets and rifles, the ground frozen, smoke rising. Two armies facing each other, hatred burning, and above them, silently, a glowing shape neither side can explain. For one heartbeat, enemies look up together, united not by peace, but by bewilderment. That was Stalingrad. That is also humanity. We divide ourselves endlessly, but mystery unites us by reminding us we are all small beneath the same sky. Some people ask me if I believe in aliens. My answer is simpler. I believe in questions. Because the light I saw was not just a phenomenon, it was a challenge. It asked whether we can accept not knowing, whether we can live without control. Dictators cannot, governments struggle, but ordinary people, soldiers, farmers, workers, sometimes carry the humility to admit wonder. Maybe that is why so many sightings are reported not by generals, but by ordinary eyes. The cosmos, if it cares, reveals itself not to power, but to humanity. As I finish this story, I think of the generations who never knew the war, but who inherit its shadows. To you, sitting in front of a glowing screen in America, perhaps sipping coffee instead of rationed soup, my words may sound like legend. But they are memory, sharpened by decades. And I ask you, when you next see a strange light in the sky, will you laugh, will you fear, or will you listen? Because history is not only what we record, it is also what we dare to wonder. If this journey through war and mystery has stirred something in you, do not let it fade. There are more stories hidden in archives, more whispers buried in rubble, more lights waiting to be seen. Subscribe to this channel. Walk with me deeper into the shadows of history, and together we will face the unknown that no empire has ever conquered.